About Maurice Hirsch. Lieutenant Colonel Maurice Hirsch is an international law expert. He's former chief military prosecutor for Judea and Samaria, specializing in the prosecution of terrorists, the Palestinian Authority, and the law applied in Judea and Samaria. Maurice was born in South Africa and educated in the United Kingdom, completing his law studies before emigrating to Israel. In the course of his military service, he served in a number of senior positions in the Military Advocate General's Corps, including assistant to the legal advisor to Judea and Samaria, head of legal advisor to the Navy, Air Force, Ground Forces, and Home Front, and ultimately at the head of the Military Prosecution for Judea and Samaria. He retired from the IDF after 19 years of service at the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. In an unusual incident, Hirsch represented the IDF and the State of Israel in talks with a UN organization that had released a particularly controversial report. His efforts were recognized as a great success, and a further report put out by the same organization was considerably more balanced. Since returning from the IDF, he now acts as head of legal strategies for Palestinian Media Watch. He's senior member of Israel's Defense and Security Forum, research fellow for the Israeli Institute for Strategic Studies, and represents victims of terror and is active in promoting anti-terror legislation. Maurice will be joined and moderated by Geoff Clarfield, a dear friend and supporter of CILR, a widely published and well-known journalist, and also a passionate anthropologist. Maurice, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Goldi, for your very kind words. I think Geoffrey's going to launch us into some questions that the background of really Jewish settlement in the land of Israel and brought about the really fundamental changes of the Balfour Declaration and thereafter the mandate. And what I'm going to discuss in this section of the presentation is how the mandate and how the mandate was really betrayed by the British. The second part of the webinar obviously will be dealt with by Robert, who will be dealing with really the more legal side of the mandate, its background and its relevance obviously today. So Geoffrey, maybe you can launch us off, please.
Sure, thank you very much, Maurice. I'll just start with a couple of sentences so that the audience can understand where I'm coming from and where you're coming from. I'd like to think that I'm representative in some way of the people who are going to be watching this. And my own experience and understanding of Jewish and Israeli history is such that the persecution of the Jewish people and the betrayal of the mandate was so powerful that one would say at an existential level, there's absolutely no doubt that Israel has a right to exist. But since 1948, there's been a tendency in Europe and North America to question Israel's right to exist on legal grounds, not because the Muslims persecuted the Jews for 1,300 years or the Holocaust or any such thing. So as the British say, I'm the man on the Clapham omnibus. I'm the average guy on the street who's faced with a dilemma. Emotionally and historically, one feels that Israel has no doubt and should be confirmed in its existence. And then there's all these legal experts who are saying Israel is an illegal blot on the landscape of the Near East. So having declared my relative ignorance, I want to start with you, Maurice, by asking you, what was the international legal status of the land of Israel during the 19th century?
So what I'm going to do with your permission, Geoffrey, is I'm going to share my screen just so that we can actually see really a series of maps that I'm going to present to the audience so that we can go along and discuss what we're talking about. When the world attacks Israel's legitimacy, they're really basing themselves on this idea that Israel came into this area of the Middle East into this area of the world and really stole something from some other people. Now, your question is so poignant because you have to understand the basic history of the area. What you're looking at now on your screen, I hope, is a map of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire ruled really for 400 odd years, already from 1517. Anyone who's really come to Israel has visited Jerusalem, has seen the big old city walls. They were built by the Ottomans soon after they conquered the area. And what we're looking at here, I'm just showing it on my screen, is this area that says Syria and then Jerusalem. Well, obviously Jerusalem isn't part of Syria, but from the point of view of the Ottomans, for that 400-year period, we're talking about from 1517 through 1917, 400 years almost to the day, we're talking about a time where there was no specific separate geographical identity for the land of Israel. It was just another one of the provinces of the Ottoman Empire. Now, this is an empire which wasn't necessarily hostile to Jews. For example, if you go to Hebron, which is really one of my favorite places in the world, because you see the history of Jewish kingship, of Jewish life, and you go and visit the shul, the synagogue, in the Jewish area of Hebron. The shul was built in 1540. The shul is now almost 500 years old in the heart of Hebron. That's where the Jews were living. So the legal background to answer your question was very simple. This area, this entire area of Israel, and we would later call Palestine as well, to include here the area of Jordan, was simply just another province of the Ottoman Empire. And that's really the easiest way to understand it. It had no background. World War I comes along, the Allied forces destroy the Ottomans and the Germans, and now this whole area needs to be redivided up.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. But what I understand is that you're giving us the outside-in approach to the fact that what Jews will call the land of Israel was merely a part of the Ottoman Empire under the Turks, who are not Arabs, for those of you who are not anthropologists. So I want to ask you from the inside out, what is and was the Jewish people relation to the land of Israel? I assume they didn't simply think that they were just a religious minority in the Eastern Mediterranean, the Ottoman Empire. Is that a reasonable approach, or do you want to rephrase it?
It's definitely reasonable, and let me even rephrase that in a way that is common for most people to understand. It's the claim that the Jews are simply colonizers that came here in the wake of the Second World War, not the First World War, and then just stole the land from the Palestinians. This simply isn't true. This is something which needs to be similarly addressed in the same way through the maps, and I'll show you again here on a very small slide as possible. I'm giving you somewhere in the region of 70, 80 to 100 years of Jewish history coming back to the land of Israel. Whether it starts in the 1810s with the students of the Vilna Gaon coming back and starting to make Aliyah, this idea of leaving predominantly Eastern Europe and moving to Israel. You also have the movement from some of the Arab countries. You then have really the big idea of two conflicting ideas. One of the movement of the Jews outside of the old city of Jerusalem, where really there'd been a tremendous force for hundreds of years, occupying that entire area and really running every type of life within the walls of the old city. Now suddenly you're moving out, Mishkanot Sha'ananim. I'm sure that you've all seen on the outside of the old city walls, the famous windmill of Moses Montefiore. Suddenly Jewish life is expanding out because it's a progress. It's a product of more and more Jews coming over time into this small area and needing more space to live. Then you start really the whole Zionist movement. When I went for the first time with the army, They take you to a Poland trip to go and really experience the disasters of the Holocaust. And so we land in one of the airports that you land in Poland to go on one of these trips is the Katowice airport. So to understand that you're landing suddenly back as officers in the army in Poland, where the Nazis and the Poles split the blood of our people, and suddenly you're landing back in Katowice, the start of the Zionist movement, and really moving through there, the creation of all of the agricultural settlements, Petach Tikva, Rishon LeZion, Zichron, Rosh Pina, Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv, we have to understand, is now 113 years old, starting really out in 1909, massive Jewish presence in Israel, really taking over everything. Jews already by 1890 were the majority in Israel. And then when you have the first census of the British in 1922, you see that in Jerusalem itself, Jews were the outright majority. What do I mean by that? There were more Jews in Jerusalem than any of the others put together, Mohammedans as they were called here, and Christians. That must be the understanding that Jews and Jewish life was very much a dominating force in Israel, and coming through to that period of World War I and understanding the changes that had happened at the time. So that's really the background of Jews keeping that connection with Israel all the time, and then probably 100 years before the Balfour Declaration, starting that mass movement of return to Israel.
That's wonderful. Let me hold you on that point a little and try and push backwards. The reason I'm saying that is, you know, you're well aware that the Old Testament and the New Testament is no longer taught in the higher institutes of Canada, the States, and Europe. The journalists and the politicians don't know their Bible. I mean, this is something that's happened in your and my lifetime when we were little boys and girls, if I can include Goldi. This was common. So the elites of Europe and North America knew the Bible, and they knew the Old Testament. And I think it was the late ambassador to the UN from Israel, Herzog, who once pulled out the Bible and the UN said, "This is the charter of the Jewish people. This is why the land of Israel belongs to us." I hope I'm not derailing your thought pattern, but could you comment a little bit upon the fact that at least Jews and Israelis recognize that the Old Testament and the Talmud are their charter for national existence? This, you know, whether you're pro-Israel or anti-Israel, this has disappeared from discourse. What are your subjective and professional thoughts about that? I know Israelis are different. They know their Bible.
So I would like to that all Israelis know their Bible, and all Israelis see the Bible as the source of Israel's legitimacy. But I don't think that is necessarily true. I think that there's a need to understand that there isn't only the biblical legitimacy for Israel's right to exist and Israel's existence, but rather also contemporary decisions that have been made by the international community, which really intertwine themselves one with the other. For those of us who are religious, we know that at least in Israel last week, we read Parashat Matot, which is talking about the division of the land and the idea of when you come back to the land of Israel and how it would be dealt with. The idea of the two tribes, Reuven and Gad, who wanted to stay on the eastern side of the border, really somewhat to an extent reflecting modern day thought. And so that is the biblical idea of where we're holding this. That it's actually very important for this period of the year, because these parashiyot, these portions of the Torah, are always read between the 17th of Tammuz and the 9th of Av, and so it's always around this period of time, and it's around the period of time when also what we're talking about today, when the mandate was given, it was given on the 18th of Tammuz. That was its a historical date, at least by the Jewish calendar, on the 24th of July, today 100 years ago.
Right. So if I can grasp your last comments, I'd like to ask you more about the Balfour Declaration and Mandate, because implied in what you just said is that the non-Jews at the time, the British who had the power, and the Jews who were hoping to get some power over their own land and destiny, understood this biblical background and understood that, in a sense, it was driving this continuous return of Jews to the land of Israel, to the point where the European powers were willing to take it seriously after, 2,000 years of anti-Semitism. So tell us a little bit about the Balfour Declaration and the establishment of the mandate, including some lines on San Remo, which even for the most ardent Zionist has been scrubbed from history. If you could do that, I'd really appreciate it.
So really what we're talking about is the period of the First World War.
That's right.
Are trying to gain as much support, external support as possible. The British will make two separate offers and commitments, one to Abdullah, to the Arab nations, and one to the Jews. The promise to the Jews will be set out in the Balfour Declaration. I'll touch on it just quickly because I think Bob is going to talk about it a little bit more in detail afterwards. So really what we're talking about is the idea of here's the Balfour Declaration. His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national homeland for the Jewish people. The first really recognition of one of the world powers at the time, that the Jews would be able to have their state, their national homeland in this area called Palestine. It's questionable what that area is. I'll touch on it a little bit, but this is really the first. This is the opening move. This is the first commitment of the world powers at the time. You have to understand and put it into context. There is no idea of a United Nations at the time. It is very much the function of the world powers that are running everything. And so when you have that commitment from a world power, it's something of really great force. The Balfour Declaration must be understood what it is. It's a declaration of policy. It's not a binding document. When you talk about now the San Remo Conference, a different story. This is April 1920. We're seeing the start, really the birth pangs of this international organization of different countries. And they get together in San Remo and they decide that we're going to divide up really the spoils of war from the defeat of the Ottomans. And they all get together and they say the British are going to be in charge of implementing what was the Balfour Declaration, and we will do it by the means of an instrument that's called a mandate. This was a relative idea at the time. The mandate was something which was then adopted by the League of Nations, which was the predecessor, obviously, of the United Nations. And that gave the legitimacy for the international community to say that this area of land will be set aside by the League of Nations, via the British, for one purpose and one purpose only, for creating the Jewish national homeland. Now, for any of you that haven't read the Mandate for Palestine, which is the document we're celebrating today, read it. This is probably what, and I say this time and time again, and I cannot stress it enough, it really is probably one of the most Zionistic documents ever written by the international community. Just going through it very quickly, putting into effect, this is just a gamble, putting into effect.
You're talking about this Mandate for Palestine, which emerged from the nascent League of Nations, the kind of ancestor of the United Nations. And it was not a Jewish document as such, is what I'm understanding from you. It was a Zionist document written by non-Jews, maybe with Jews on the side. Is that right?
Exactly. It wasn't a Jewish document at all. This is the international community saying that they recognize the historical connection of the Jewish people with this area called Palestine, and the grounds for reconstituting a national homeland, not starting over, not creating something from nothing, but rather recognizing that there once was a Jewish people. The Jewish people lived in this land that was called Israel, that changed its name to Palestine, and that historical connection has carried on even through 2,000 years later.
It's a remarkable historical fact that you're highlighting here. It was almost as if there was a new dawn and a new light and a new hope internationally and for the Jewish people. After 2,000 years, the Jewish people were being recognized as a nation and not as opponents of Christianity or Islam. So, you know, when you know, you and people like Mark Vandermaas have encouraged me to read this and take it very seriously. I've done it a number of times. It kind of makes me cry because subsequent reading has told me that from almost day one, the British administrators in charge of the mandate betrayed it. Lock, stock, and two smoking barrels. So tell us a little bit about that. What would it be? 1920, 48-year betrayal, systematic and across the board.
So you're right. So what we're talking about at the moment, the original area of the mandate is on the left. It shows the entire area of Israel, including what is today Jordan. The British, the first move of the British was obviously to separate off Transjordan, to make good on their promise to Abdallah, to the Arabs who had joined in that effort against the Ottomans. And so they already put into the mandate itself the option of separating off this area of Transjordan. What we were left was the blue and white area, which was meant to be Israel and the Jewish homeland, but that really from the start was completely betrayed, unfortunately, by the British. It started from really into the period of the mandate, and it was always a response to the violence from the Arabs, inhabitants of Israel, who were unhappy with this idea that there would be a Jewish homeland in the land of Israel. That's right. That they really ignored. And so we jump very quickly to this period of time again, in 1929, the Arab massacre of the Jews. The Arabs will claim that the Jews were saying their psalms in a provocative manner by the Western Wall, and that will be their justification to murder 130 Jews. And the British will set up the Shaw Commission. Now, in the Shaw Commission, obviously the different breaches by the British of the mandate were so extensive and so many. So I'm only going to touch on a few of them, just trying to paint a few common themes. Here, for example, 1929, this is the Shaw Commission. They're investigating why the Arabs decided to kill the Jews. And one of the most amazing claims already, the mandate starts in 1922. Its purpose is to create the Jewish state. And here they say it's freely admitted, no state land was ever provided for the purpose of Jewish settlement. Well, what were you doing with the land then? Where was that land going? Why were you just administering it and not giving it to the Jews for the purpose that you had been given the mandate? The mandate isn't sovereignty by the UK. The mandate's purpose was to give over that land to the Jews. The second part, which I highlighted here, nonetheless, the Jews are now in possession of more than 1 million dunams that was purchased by the Jews and frequently at a high price. What was the claim of the Arabs? Well, we've got no land. These Jews that are coming in are taking all our land away. And so here in the Shaw Commission, instead of saying, well, if your land is important to you, don't sell it to the Jews, what the Shaw Commission really did was it really played into that Arab narrative of, well, we sold the land, we've taken the money, even at a high price, but we still want to have our cake and still eat it and still keep it whole. And so that was really the first idea of this idea of how would the land in Israel, in Palestine, be divided up? Why was it not given over? That's one theme, land. The second theme is the idea of immigration. Well, the Jews are meant to come from all over the world to this new homeland where they will sit on the land that was given to the British for the purpose of creating this Jewish homeland. What do the British already suggest in 1929 as a result of Arab violence? The British policy should be to regulate, as they call it, regulate immigration into Palestine. Well, why should it be regulated? Jews should be allowed to move in freely. At this period of time already, they're imposing restrictions on the number of Jews coming in. Most of the Jews at this stage are coming in from the European countries, from the Western countries. At the same time, you've got massive Arab immigration into Israel, which is coming across the porous borders, whether it be from Syria, from Jordan, from Lebanon. And so at the same time as the British are now regulating the Jewish immigration, the Arab immigration is running freely. What do the Arabs learn from that? Violence and the murder of Jews brings about political gain. So you have another commission set up after the Arab riots in 1936. This is the Peel Commission. Now, this is really the start of what would be a tremendous change in British policy. The Peel Commission, for the first time, talks about more substantive measures for limiting illegal immigration on the one hand, and then, as you see in the middle of our screen, this first idea of a petition plan. We're now leaving the idea, the paradigm of a two-state solution, one Arab state, which is Jordan, and one Jewish state, which is Israel. And we're now, again, the British are suggesting this idea of petitioning that small area of land that was given for the purpose of the Jewish homeland. Now, we have to, as we go along there, that idea of illegal immigration, obviously everyone will have heard of and will play into the idea of the white paper, the infamous white paper, limiting Jewish immigration into Israel. This is something which obviously 1937, 1939, when it finally comes out, this is the idea, really, the implementation of the recommendations, both of the Shaw Commission and of the Peel Commission. Now we have a specific policy of limiting Jews coming into Palestine. At the time, obviously, we're talking about the start of World War II. We've already seen all of the implications of the Nazis taking control of Jewish life and really about to start with the Holocaust. And at the same time, what are the British doing? They're limiting Jewish immigration into the land of Israel. Now, luckily, it must be said that the white paper had its advantages. The white paper in 1939 said, we're going to limit Jewish immigration. On the other hand, and what's less discussed from the white paper, was the only spark of hope was that the white paper rejected the recommendation of the Peel Commission to partition the land of Israel. But that's really the only formal expression that we'll see of that. As we know, the British didn't really carry on with that idea. And really, it was the British who were a major driving force behind the newly constituted United Nations. The League of Nations falls apart with World War II. The United Nations replaces the League of Nations, and immediately almost you have this idea of a partition plan for Palestine. And here we have the Jewish country, which is really the greeny blue, and the Arab country in brown. As we all know, the Jews accept the petition plan, the Arab countries reject the petition plan, and they start with a war to exterminate Israel, going to Israel's war of independence. I apologize. Every ex-army person has to have a map where you have troop movements. So just to explain, you have this idea of around here in this middle area is the petition plan was meant to be the Arab country. The Arab nations invade. They push Israel back for a while until Israel manages to push the Arab armies back, gaining land both in the north, in the area of the Galil, at the top of the map, and in the south, pushing back all the way past the original line of the petition part to this line here, which you can see very faintly is the 1949 armistice lines, that what's called, or will later be called, the Green Line. And there you have that idea of finishing up the comparison, obviously, on the left-hand side of the screen. This is the partition plan, and this is Israel after of independence, creating this really much more substantial area for Jewish life, and pushing back the Egyptians on the one hand into the Gaza Strip, and the Jordanians that will remain of Judea and Samaria. And that really is where I will possibly just point out one of the most fundamental breaches of the mandate. Obviously, the mandate starts in 1922. As I said, its sole purpose is to empower the United Kingdom to create in this entire area of Palestine, in this entire area of Israel, a homeland for the Jewish people. As we said, the white paper rejected the idea of a partition plan. So when Jordan comes in and occupies the area of Judea and Samaria illegally, from all intents and purposes, specifically from a legal point of view, what would you then think that the British would say to the Jordanians? They just created Jordan. What should they have said to the Jordanians is very clear. You have nothing to do in this area. You are required to leave. You have your state. We made good on our promise, and now leave. Instead of doing that, in 1950, the British will really lay that final layer of betrayal of the mandate, when in 1950 they will recognize the unification of the East Bank with what is now called by the Jordanians the West Bank. This term, the West Bank, which we so know today, has no historical background in the partition plan. It's referred to as the hilly area of Judea and Samaria. But now Britain will say, in breach really entirely of the mandate, not only are we not going to require the Jordanians to leave that area, but we're actually giving official diplomatic recognition to the fact that the Jordanians have illegally occupied that area. Luckily for the rest of the world, and definitely for Israel, the British were only one of two countries that recognized the Jordanian occupation and annexation of Judea and Samaria, just United Kingdom and Pakistan. Some people also say Iraq, but that's not certain. And so really, this is the final betrayal of the mandate, saying that we are not only going to ignore our international commitment to give this entire area to the Jewish people, we're actually going to recognize foreign intervention and foreign sovereignty over that area.
That's incredibly helpful. I'll tell you why. From, again, the layperson's point of view, is when people like yourself recommend that we read these documents and change the way we look at things, the betrayal of the national homeland, we think, ends in 1948, when the Israelis, plucky little tribe, got their independence back against 5 invading armies, including a Jordanian army run by British officers, which is almost funny if it wasn't so tragic. It brings us to really up to the present. Now I'm looking at the time, and I think we only have 3-4 minutes, you and I right now. So I guess I'd like to bring this back to you as an Israeli living, working, arguing in the state of Israel. Is the Israeli government going to celebrate this 100th anniversary of the mandate this year, or is it going to disappear from the schedule? Do you know, could you tell us here in the diaspora anything about that?
So I think that Israel tends to celebrate the more current events of Israel and the more contemporary history of Israel, from the War of Independence, celebrating Israel's Independence Day, and really taking that on as the national identity and the national holidays. There are the 3 days, obviously, which should be really signaled out. One of them being the 2nd of November, which incredibly was the date that I went into the army. The second being obviously the date of the San Remo convention and conference, and the third being the centennial of the mandate. But I think really we go back there to your original question, whereas I think now the modern day state of Israel, as much as it doesn't necessarily see the Bible as its source for its legitimacy to exist today to its full extent, that biblical reference is still there. And so when you're talking about the idea of celebrating Israel's even Day of Independence, we don't celebrate our Independence Day based on the Gregorian calendar. We celebrate our Independence Day based on the Hebrew calendar. So Hey Iyar will be the date that everything is being celebrated. As I said, mentioned before, Yud Chet B'Tammuz, the 18th day of Tammuz, isn't a day of celebration really in the Jewish calendar. And so it's something which is much more difficult to celebrate today. But it is something which Israel, I think, is talking about more and more as time goes on, recognizing that we don't only hold the biblical right to this country, but also international legitimacy from dating back from really Balfour and Remo and
my last question, which I know could trigger a very organized lecture, but I'll ask you to take into account the time considerations, is that there was this wonderful concatenation where the needs of the Jewish people to reestablish sovereignty after World War I and the international community were in sync, and then that unraveled and continues to do so today. So maybe it's simplistic to say, why do Israel's enemies ignore the mandate for Palestine as a legal document?
The answer to that is very, 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 very simple. Because they can. Because the international community itself has tried its best to deny the validity of the mandate, to expunge the history of the mandate, to say, well, after the mandate, we made this decision of the petition plan in 1947, and we don't really care if the Arabs accepted it or not. But that's going to be our goal, and we're going to try and push that all the way, because really we don't want to fight with the Arab countries. It became obviously much more of an intense conflict as oil was discovered, and oil became such a tremendous resource for the whole world, and so you have that really meeting of both ideas and interests, where the Western countries, the international community, is so desperate for Arab oil and Arab resources, and the Arabs are not willing to accept anything related to Israel. There's actually a 1951 report from the UN of the discussions between the Arabs and the Jews after Israel's War of Independence, how it would work itself out, and how the petition plan could be implemented. We're now 70 odd years on. Nothing has changed since then. Really, nothing has changed since then. The idea, the Jews had said, all we want is for the Arabs to recognize our right to exist as a Jewish country in whatever given borders. And all the Arabs have said, and it goes today to the Palestinian Authority all the way through, first, agree that Israel should be flooded with all of these so-called refugees, so that we can demographically destroy any Jewish future in Israel. And really, since then, we haven't moved on in 70 years.
It's remarkable.
Are really staying on. We haven't really moved on in 100 years.
Right.
That's the basis for ignoring everything. You can rewrite and ignore reality, and rewrite history as it may be convenient for whatever your purpose may be.
So if I could just finish off by saying that, we like to think that history progresses and gets better. And at a certain level, Israel is a much stronger state than it was as a community in 1920. But from a legal point of view, Israel is worse off in the eyes of the nations, as they say in Hebrew, than it was in 1920 or 1921. It's a very sobering message, or a sobering conclusion. And with that, I'd like to thank you, because I always learn stuff. You and I have been corresponding for the last few weeks. I'm very grateful, very helpful. Your insights are backed up by really solid research, which is rare this day.